I never thought that something as small as a bowl of soup could change my life forever. But that night, standing in my own kitchen, with bruises already forming on my arms, I realized that even the tiniest details can shatter a family. I am 65 years old. I was born and raised in a small town in Pennsylvania, in a time when family dinners meant everything. My mother taught me to cook when I was barely tall enough to see over the stove. She always said food was love, that every spoonful you gave to someone was a part of your heart. And all my life I believed that. I cooked for my husband, for my children, for the neighbors who needed comfort when times were hard. Cooking was my way of holding everyone together. So imagine the irony that the very thing I had devoted my life to, the simple act of making soup, would be the reason my own son raised his hand against me. That evening was like any other. I had been moving slower these days. My knees don't always cooperate, and my hands tremble when I carry heavy pots. But I was determined to make dinner. My son Mark had been living with me since his divorce. He was 40, angry at the world, bitter about losing his job, and often short-tempered. Still, he was my son. I told myself he just needed time, patience, and love. I made chicken noodle soup that night, the kind my late husband used to adore. The smell filled the kitchen, and for a moment it felt like home again. When I set the bowl in front of Mark, I expected the usual silence as he ate. But instead, he slammed his spoon down so hard that broth splashed across the table. "There's no salt," he barked. His voice was sharp, cutting through me like glass. I froze. My hearing isn't as sharp as it once was, and I wasn't sure if I had forgotten the salt. I started to apologize, to tell him I could fix it, but before I could speak, he stood up so quickly that the chair scraped against the floor. His face was red, his fists clenched. "How many times do I have to tell you?" he shouted. "Do you even listen anymore?" I tried to explain, my voice trembling, but he didn't want to hear it. The next thing I knew, his hand struck me across the cheek. The sound echoed in the small kitchen, louder than any thunder I'd ever heard. My vision blurred for a moment, and I staggered back against the counter. I couldn't believe it. My son, my own flesh and blood, the baby I had rocked to sleep, the boy I had kissed goodnight 1,000 times, had just hit me. And not once. His anger didn't stop there. He shoved me, his fists gripping my arm so hard I knew bruises would bloom by morning. I don't remember what I said, or if I said anything at all. All I remember is the silence that followed after he finally let go. My soup sat on the table untouched, steam still rising as though mocking me. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled, and I sank to the floor, my body shaking, my heart breaking. I pressed my hand against my cheek, feeling the sting of his palm, and tears fell. Not just because of the pain, but because in that moment I felt like I had lost my son forever. The hours after that blurred together. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the bowl of soup that had started it all. I thought about calling the police, but my fingers froze over the phone. How could I report my own child? What would the neighbors say? What would it mean for him? But another voice inside me whispered, "What about me?" I had spent my life caring for everyone else. I had stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, worked extra shifts to pay for college, and held his hand through every fever. And now at 65, I was sitting alone in the dark, too afraid to move in my own home. The truth was, this wasn't the first time Mark had lost his temper. It wasn't even the second. He had shouted at me before, thrown things, broken a plate or two when dinner wasn't ready on time. I had always excused it. He was stressed, he was hurting, he just needed more love. But being struck, being beaten, was something I could no longer deny. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I made a decision. My life was not going to end in fear. My story was not going to be defined by the violence of the very child I had given life to. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew this. Something had to change. And so, with swollen eyes and aching arms, I stood up, poured the cold soup down the drain, and whispered into the empty kitchen. Enough is enough. The morning after that terrible night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My cheek was swollen, purple bruises traced down my arms, and for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked broken, old, defeated. But inside, a small flame had sparked, a flame I hadn't felt in years. I tied my hair back, washed my face, and whispered to myself, "You are stronger than this. When Mark came downstairs later, his eyes avoided mine. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look ashamed. Instead, he grabbed a cup of coffee, muttered something under his breath about being late, and left the house as though nothing had happened. That hurt even more than the blows. It told me that he saw me not as his mother, not even as a person, but as someone he could control, someone he could take his anger out on. And I realized that if I didn't stop him now, it would only get worse. I spent the day thinking about what to do. The easy choice would have been to pretend nothing had happened, to sweep the broken pieces of myself under the rug like I had so many times before. But my heart kept repeating those words from last night. Enough is enough. In the afternoon, I pulled out an old shoebox from under my bed. Inside were photographs of happier days. Mark's first birthday, his high school graduation, the day he married his wife. I touched each picture gently, remembering the boy who once held my hand at the park, who once told me I was the best mom in the world. Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to keep looking. Because that boy was gone, and the man living in my house now was not the same. That evening when he came home, I set dinner on the table, simple mashed potatoes and baked chicken. My hands trembled as I placed his plate down, not from fear this time, but from determination. He looked at me and scoffed. "What's this? No gravy." Something inside me snapped, but not in anger. In clarity. I met his eyes for the first time in years, held his gaze steady and said, "Mark, this is the last dinner you will ever eat in this house as long as you treat me this way." For a moment he just stared, surprised. Then his face twisted with rage. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath. My voice shook, but I didn't let it break. "I raised you. I gave you everything I had. But I will not be your punching bag. If you ever lift a hand against me again, I will call the police. Do you hear me? I will not be silent anymore." His chair screeched as he stood up. For a second I thought he might hit me again. My whole body tensed. But something about the way I stood tall, the way my voice didn't waver, must have startled him. He muttered curses, slammed his fist against the table, and stormed out of the room. The house shook with the force of the door slamming behind him. But this time I didn't collapse in fear. I stayed standing, my hands pressed against the table, my heart pounding, and for the first time in years I felt powerful. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering if I had done the right thing. Part of me feared retaliation, feared he might come back drunk or angrier. But another part of me knew I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. The next morning I called my neighbor Linda. She was a kind woman in her 70s, someone who had brought me casseroles after my husband died. When she saw the bruises on my arms, her face went pale. "Oh honey," she whispered. "You can't keep living like this." "I don't know what to do," I admitted. My voice cracked. "He's my son." She held my hand and said words I'll never forget. "Being a mother doesn't mean accepting abuse. Love is not supposed to hurt like this." She encouraged me to go to the police, to file a report, to at least create a record. And though my heart ached at the thought of turning my son over to the law, I also knew she was right. That afternoon I found myself sitting in the small, cold waiting room of the local police station. My hands were trembling as I filled out the report, each word feeling like a betrayal, but also like a confession of the truth I had hidden for too long. When the officer asked, "Has this happened before?" I wanted to say no, but the truth came spilling out of me. The shouting, the broken dishes, the slammed doors, the insults, the fear that had built up over years. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. The officer handed me a pamphlet about domestic abuse hotlines and shelters. He spoke gently, reminding me that I wasn't alone. For the first time I believed him. I walked out of that station lighter, though my heart still hurt. I had done something I never thought I could. I had chosen myself. But deep down I also knew this was just the beginning. Because the hardest part wasn't reporting my son. The hardest part was yet to come. Deciding what to do about him, about us, about the bond that had been shattered in a single night over a bowl of soup. It all started with something so small that no one in their right mind could ever imagine it leading to the kind of storm that would turn my whole life upside down. My name is Margaret. I'm 65 years old, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio. For most of my life, I believed in keeping family together no matter what. I raised my children with that principle even when times were tough. My husband passed away a few years back, and since then my eldest son Daniel has been living with me. Daniel was 43, unemployed, and still trying to figure out his life, as he liked to call it. He had always been quick-tempered, but I kept telling myself it was just stress, that maybe if I showed him enough love, he would eventually calm down. After all, he was my son. A mother's love doesn't just disappear, no matter how old your children are. That evening, I made soup the way I had for years. It was a recipe passed down from my mother, hearty, warm, and filled with vegetables from the small garden in my backyard. I set the bowl down in front of him, expecting nothing more than the usual quiet dinner together. But as soon as he took a spoonful, his face twisted. "There's no salt," he snapped, slamming the spoon onto the table so hard that broth splashed onto the tablecloth. I opened my mouth to explain that I had intentionally cut back on the salt for health reasons, both his and mine, but I never got the chance. Before I could say a word, he pushed back his chair violently and stood over me, his face red with anger. "Do you think I'm a joke to you?" he shouted, his voice shaking the walls of the house. And then he raised his hand. The first strike stunned me more than it hurt. I couldn't believe it was happening. My own son, the child I had nursed, bathed, and sacrificed for, was hitting me over something as trivial as soup. He shoved me back, and I fell against the kitchen counter. My heart raced as fear clawed at me. I wasn't young anymore. At my age, one wrong fall could mean a broken bone or worse. "Daniel, stop," I begged, my voice trembling. But my words only seemed to fuel his anger. When he finally stormed off, leaving me shaking and clutching my side, I sank to the floor. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the tiled floor, tears streaming down my cheeks. I wasn't crying from the pain, I was crying from the heartbreak. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought came to me. For years, I had made excuses for Daniel. I told myself he was just struggling, that he needed me, that one day he would change. But the truth was staring me right in the face. I was enabling him. And if I didn't do something now, it would only get worse. The next morning, I quietly packed a small suitcase. Not because I was leaving, but because I wanted to remind myself that I had options. I wasn't trapped. I also picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years, my younger sister, Caroline. When she answered, her warm, familiar voice cracked something open inside me. I told her everything. Every ugly detail. There was silence on the line at first, and then she said words that stuck with me. "Margaret, you deserve peace. You deserve safety. Don't let love blind you to abuse." Her words echoed in my heart all day. That evening, when Daniel came stomping into the kitchen like he always did, I stood taller than I felt. "Dinner's on the counter," I said calmly, not meeting his eyes. He grumbled, took his plate, and went into the living room. But I didn't sit with him this time. I sat in my bedroom, my heart pounding with the decision I had made. The next day, I went to the police station. My hands trembled as I told the officer what had happened. Filing a report against your own child is something no mother should ever have to do. But I knew if I stayed silent, I was signing my own misery. When the officer asked if I wanted to press charges, my throat tightened. Could I really do this? Could I really stand against my own flesh and blood? But then I remembered the way his hand felt striking me. The rage in his eyes. The way I had sat on that cold kitchen floor feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. "Yes," I whispered. What followed was a storm. Daniel was arrested. He screamed at me as they took him away, calling me a traitor, swearing I'd regret it. My heart broke all over again, but I stood my ground. For the first time in years, I chose myself. The days after were quiet. Too quiet, almost. I kept replaying everything in my mind, asking myself if I had done the right thing. And then one evening, as I was sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, my neighbor Mrs. Harris came over. She had heard what happened, and instead of judgment, she offered me something I hadn't felt in a long time: support. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret," she said softly. Her words, along with Caroline's calls, gave me strength. I started attending support groups for women who had gone through similar situations. Sitting in those rooms, listening to stories that mirrored mine, I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't weak. I was surviving. Weeks later, Daniel called me from jail. For the first time in a long time, his voice wasn't angry, it was broken. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what came over me. I need help." Tears filled my eyes, but I stayed steady. Yes, Daniel. You do need help. And for once, you're going to have to get it without leaning on me. That was the turning point. I won't lie and say everything magically healed after that. It didn't. My son had to face consequences, and I had to rebuild my sense of worth. But I learned something valuable. Love doesn't mean accepting abuse. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and even for the person hurting you, is to set boundaries. Months later, I found myself smiling again. I joined a book club, started gardening more, and even traveled to visit Caroline. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And every time I sat down to eat dinner, I seasoned my food just the way I liked it. No fear, no shouting, no violence. Just peace. And that peace was worth every ounce of courage it took to stand up that day. Because in the end, my story isn't just about soup without salt. It's about realizing that even at 65, even when the world tells you it's too late, you can choose freedom.